In the shadow world of special operations, where the most elite warriors on Earth wage wars that will never appear in history books, there exists a hierarchy forged in blood, sweat, and the unforgiving crucible of combat. Every operator earns their place through years of suffering, through trials that break 99% of those who attempt them, through missions that test the very limits of human capability. So when a quiet, unassuming rookie with identification number 878 arrived at SEAL Team 6's compound in Virginia Beach, no one, not the battle-hardened veterans, not the legendary operators who had killed more enemies than they could count, not even the commanding officers who had seen everything war could offer, suspected that this young man carried a secret that would change everything they thought they knew about courage, about sacrifice, about what it truly means to be a warrior. This is the story of Operation Neptune Spear, the most significant military operation of the 21st century, and the rookie who was never supposed to be there, until a classified briefing revealed that he was exactly where he was always meant to be. Stay until the end, because what you are about to witness will challenge everything you believe about fate, about family, and about the unbreakable bonds that connect generations of warriors across time. The Black Hawk helicopter's rotors beat against the Afghan night, like the wings of some prehistoric predator, filling the cargo bay with a thunderous rhythm that Petty Officer Marcus Cole could feel, resonating through his bones. He sat in the darkness among Legends men whose names were whispered in reverent tones. Throughout the special operations community, operators who had conducted more classified missions than most people knew existed. And in the far corner, barely visible in the dim red glow of the interior lights, sat the rookie they called 878, his face obscured by night vision goggles, his hands resting with unusual stillness on his modified HK-416 rifle. Marcus had been with SEAL Team 6 for 3 years now, had earned his place through blood and broken bones and the kind of suffering that David Goggins himself would have recognized as the forging fire of true warriors. But this rookie, this quiet, unremarkable young operator who had arrived at the compound only 4 months ago, remained an enigma that none of them could solve. He spoke rarely, trained obsessively, and possessed a calm that seemed almost supernatural for someone so new to the most elite unit in military history. Commander Jackson Hawk Morrison sat at the front of the helicopter, his weathered face carved from granite by 22 years of continuous combat operations. He had been there for the beginning of the War on Terror, had hunted high-value targets across 3 continents, had buried friends whose names would never appear on any memorial. His eyes, those cold, assessing eyes that had stared down death more times than he could remember, kept drifting toward the rookie in the corner. There was something about 878 that disturbed him, something familiar that he couldn't quite place, like a melody half-remembered from childhood. The young man's file was remarkably thin for someone who had made it through the brutal selection process. Basic biographical data, training scores that were exceptional but not record-breaking, psychological evaluations that described him as unusually composed, and demonstrates advanced tactical intuition inconsistent with experience level. Morrison had made inquiries through back channels, had called in favors from intelligence contacts who owed him their lives, but every avenue led to the same answer: classified above your clearance level. In 22 years of service, Hawk Morrison had never encountered a restriction that applied to him. Until now, Senior Chief Antonio Priest Vargas completed the core team, a Cuban-American warrior whose faith was matched only by his lethality. He carried a rosary blessed by his grandmother wrapped around his left wrist, and a knife that had ended 17 enemy combatants in close-quarters combat strapped to his chest. Priest had been the one to give the rookie his call sign, not 878, which was merely his identification number, but Ghost, because the young man moved through the compound like a specter, appearing and disappearing without sound, without trace, without the normal human presence that even the most skilled operators projected. Priest had seen many things in his 15 years of service, had witnessed miracles and atrocities in equal measure, and something in his soul, that part of him that still knelt in prayer each morning before dawn, recognized that this rookie was different, not better or worse than the rest of them, but different in a way that defied easy categorization. As Napoleon Bonaparte once observed, there are moments in war when the deepest calculations give way to a single glance, and Priest had been watching Ghost with increasingly calculating glances since the day he arrived. The classified briefing took place in a windowless room beneath the Pentagon, a space so secret that its existence was known to fewer than 50 people in the entire United States government. Admiral William Chen stood at the front of the room, his for stars gleaming under harsh fluorescent lights, his face betraying none of the tension that coursed through his veins. Behind him, a satellite image filled the screen of compound in Abbottabad, Pakistan, 3 stories tall, surrounded by high walls topped with barbed wire. The room contained the 24 operators who had been selected for the mission, plus a handful of CIA analysts and military planners whose names would never be recorded. When Admiral Chen began speaking, his voice was steady, measured, carrying the weight of history that he knew this moment represented. "Gentlemen," he said, "we have located Osama bin Laden." The silence that followed was absolute, profound. The kind of silence that falls when men realize they are standing at the crossroads of destiny. For nearly a decade, the most wanted man in the world had evaded the most sophisticated intelligence apparatus ever assembled. And now, in this underground room, the warriors who would bring him to justice sat in stunned recognition of what they were being asked to do. The mission parameters were unlike anything they had ever attempted. They would fly the modified Black Hawk helicopters deep into Pakistani territory, without that nation's knowledge or consent, insert into a compound located less than a mile from Pakistan's premier military academy, eliminate the target, collect intelligence, and extract before Pakistani forces could respond. The margin for error was zero. The consequences of failure were catastrophic not just for them personally, but for the nation they served, for the families of every victim who had died on September 11th, for the very concept of justice in a world that often seemed devoid of it. Commander Morrison listened with the analytical focus of a veteran operator, mentally cataloging ingress routes, potential complications, contingency plans for scenarios that ranged from mechanical failure to full-scale combat with Pakistani military forces. But when Admiral Chen reached a certain section of the briefing, a section marked with classification headers that Morrison had never seen before, everything changed. "There is one additional element to this mission," the Admiral said, his eyes scanning the room until they locked onto the quiet figure of Ghost sitting in the back row. "Operator 878 will be assigned to the primary assault team. His participation is non-negotiable and comes directly from the highest authority. The more you sweat in training, the less you bleed in combat." Richard Marcinko, founder of SEAL Team 6, the objection erupted from Morrison before he could stop himself. Years of discipline momentarily overwhelmed by the sheer absurdity of what he was hearing. "Admiral, with all due respect, this is the most important operation in the history of special operations. We cannot include a rookie who has never seen actual combat on the primary assault element." The room seemed to hold its breath as the commander challenged the Admiral's directive, the tension crackling like electricity before a storm. But Admiral Chen's response was not what anyone expected. Instead of reprimand or explanation, he simply nodded to a figure standing in the shadows at the edge of the room, a man in civilian clothes whom Morrison had assumed was another CIA analyst. The figure stepped forward into the light, and Commander Morrison felt his heart stop. He knew that face. Every American knew that face. Standing before them was Director Leon Panetta himself, the head of the Central Intelligence Agency, a man who had no business being in a tactical briefing for a SEAL Team 6 operation. Director Panetta approached the podium with the measured stride of someone who had spent decades navigating the corridors of power, and when he spoke, his words carried the gravity of secrets that had been classified for over 2 decades. "What I am about to tell you," Panetta began, "does not leave this room. It is not recorded in any file. It will never be acknowledged by any government agency. But you deserve to know why Operator 878 will be on that helicopter when you fly into Abbottabad." He paused, and in that pause, Ghost rose from his seat and walked to the front of the room, his movements fluid and controlled, his face still obscured by shadows that seemed to cling to him like a second skin. 23 years ago, Panetta continued, during the Soviet-Afghan War, a CIA operative named Thomas Reeves conducted the most successful covert operation in agency history. He infiltrated the Mujahideen, identified Osama bin Laden as an emerging threat years before anyone else recognized his significance, and gathered intelligence that could have prevented the rise of Al-Qaeda entirely. But the operation was compromised. Thomas Reeves was captured, tortured, and executed by bin Laden himself. His body was never recovered. His name was erased from every record. His family was told he died in a training accident. The room had gone absolutely still, every operator leaning forward, sensing that they were about to learn something that would change their understanding of everything. And then Director Panetta spoke the words that shattered the silence like a thunderbolt from heaven. Thomas Reeves had a son. He was 3 years old when his father was murdered. That boy grew up never knowing the truth about how his father died, never knowing that his father was a hero whose sacrifice had been buried by the very government he served. But that boy felt the absence like a wound that never healed, carried it through childhood and adolescence and into adulthood, where it drove him to become something extraordinary. He joined the Navy at 18, passed Bud S on his first attempt with scores that instructors still talk about, and was recruited into SEAL Team 6 faster than any operator in the unit's history. Ghost stepped fully into the light, and for the first time, the assembled operators saw his face clearly young, yes, but bearing an expression of resolve that seemed ancient, eternal, forged in the fires of a grief that had shaped his entire existence. "My name," he said, his voice steady as bedrock, "is Daniel Reeves, and I have spent my entire life preparing for this moment." The revelation hung in the air like smoke from an explosion, and Commander Morrison felt something shift in his chest, the cynicism of 2 decades of warfare giving way to something he had almost forgotten he could feel. This was not just a mission. This was fate itself, reaching across 23 years to deliver justice through the hands of a son who had never stopped hunting his father's killer. "I will not be stopped. I will not be denied. I am coming, and hell is coming with me." Adapted from the Warrior's Creed the 2 weeks before the operation, blurred into an endless cycle of rehearsals, briefings, and physical conditioning that pushed even these elite warriors to their limits. They built a full-scale replica of the Abbottabad compound in a remote corner of North Carolina, practicing their assault until every movement became instinct, until they could navigate the structure blindfolded, until the choreography of controlled violence was burned into their muscle memory. Daniel, they called him by his name now. The anonymity of Ghost having dissolved in the revelation of his true identity trained within. Intensity that bordered on obsession. He was always the first to arrive and the last to leave, running through scenarios while others slept, studying satellite imagery until his eyes burned, memorizing every potential position, where bin Laden might hide, every escape route he might attempt to use. Commander Morrison watched this young man with new eyes, seeing not just a rookie, but a warrior fulfilling a destiny that had been written in blood. To decades before his birth, George S. Patton had once declared that a good plan today is better than a perfect plan tomorrow. But Morrison understood now that some plans required generations to come to fruition, that some missions were not measured in days or weeks, but in lifetimes. Senior Chief Vargas found Daniel alone one night, standing at the edge of the compound replica, staring at the structure that represented everything he had been working toward since childhood. The moon hung low over the Carolina pines, casting silver light across the mock buildings and barriers that would soon give way to the real thing in a country halfway around the world. Priest approached quietly, his rosary clicking softly against his tactical vest, and stood beside the young operator without speaking. The silence stretched between them, comfortable rather than awkward. The kind of silence that exists between men who understand that some things cannot be expressed in words. Finally, Daniel spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "I used to dream about him," he said. "My father. I would see him in my dreams, and he would tell me to be strong, to keep going, to never give up. I thought they were just dreams, just my mind trying to fill the void where a father should have been. But now I wonder if somehow, in some way I can't explain, he knew. He knew this moment would come, and he was preparing me for it." Priest reached out and placed a hand on Daniel's shoulder, feeling the tension that vibrated through the young man's frame like a coiled spring. "Your father sees you," he said softly, "wherever he is, whatever lies beyond this world. He sees what you have become, and when you walk into that compound, he will be walking beside you." They stood together until dawn painted the sky with fire, two warriors on the eve of battle, one carrying the weight of faith and the other carrying the weight of legacy. The night of May 1st, 2011, descended over Jalalabad airfield in Afghanistan like a curtain falling on the final act of a decades-long drama. The two modified Blackhawk specially designed stealth variants, whose existence was classified at the highest levels, sat on the tarmac like sleeping predators, their rotors still, their cargo bays waiting to receive the men who would write history. Daniel Reeves checked his equipment for the 100th time, his hands moving with mechanical precision over rifle, magazines, night vision, first aid kit, breaching charges, the tactical gear that had become an extension of his body through thousands of hours of training. His heart was steady, his breathing controlled, his mind focused with crystalline clarity on the mission ahead. Somewhere in Pakistan, approximately 160 miles away, the man who had murdered his father was sleeping in a compound that he believed was impenetrable, protected by walls and bodyguards, and a comfortable assumption that nearly a decade of evasion had earned him safety. That assumption would be shattered before dawn. Commander Morrison gathered his team for a final brief, his voice carrying the calm authority of a man who had led warriors into hell and brought them back again. He looked at each face and turned Marcus Cole, whose steady hands had defused bombs in Iraq, Priest Vargas, whose faith and ferocity made him equally at home in a chapel or a firefight, and Daniel Reeves, the rookie who was not a rookie, the son returning to collect the debt written in his father's blood. The helicopters lifted off at precisely 2,300 hours, their modified engines producing barely a whisper as they rose into the Afghan night and turned toward the Pakistani border. Inside the lead aircraft, Daniel sat with his back against the fuselage, feeling the vibration of flight through his body, watching the stars wheel overhead through the open cargo door. He thought about his mother, who still believed his father had died in a training accident, who had raised him alone with a grief she never fully explained, who had watched him join the military, with tears in her eyes and a strange expression that he now understood was recognition, that her son was following the same path that had led his father to glory and to death. He thought about the photograph he kept in his quarters back in Virginia Beach, the only picture of his father that had survived the government's purge of Thomas Reeves' existence. A young man in civilian clothes standing in front of a mud brick building somewhere in Afghanistan, his face bearing the same expression of quiet determination that Daniel saw every morning in his own mirror. He thought about the distance they were crossing, not just in miles, but in years, in grief, in the long journey from abandoned child to avenging warrior. Sun Tzu wrote that the greatest victory is that which requires no battle. But Daniel understood that some battles could not be avoided. Some debts could only be paid in blood. Some journeys could only end one way. It is fatal to enter any war without the will to win it. General Douglas MacArthur of the compound appeared on their night vision like a glowing ghost, its walls and buildings rendered in shades of green and black by the sophisticated optics that transformed darkness into day. Commander Morrison's voice crackled through the intercom, steady and professional despite the magnitude of what they were about to attempt. 30 seconds to insertion. Final weapons check. The operators moved with synchronized precision, charging handles pulled, safeties verified, magazines seated firmly in their wells. Daniel felt his pulse quicken for the first time since they had lifted off, not from fear, but from anticipation, from the knowledge that 23 years of waiting were about to end in the next few minutes. The lead helicopter began its descent toward the compound's courtyard, its modified rotors struggling against the thin mountain air and the unusual acoustics created by the high walls. And then everything went wrong. The aircraft shuddered violently, caught in a vortex of its own downwash reflected by the compound walls, and the pilot's voice cut through the silence with words that no operator ever wants to hear. "We're going down." The crash seemed to happen in slow motion, the helicopter's tail striking the compound wall, the aircraft rotating sickeningly, the world becoming a chaos of metal and sparks and the screaming of tortured machinery. Daniel was thrown against the fuselage as the helicopter slammed into the ground, his head striking something hard enough to fill his vision with stars. For a moment, a terrible, disorienting moment, he was back in his childhood, lying in his bed in the darkness, hearing his mother crying in the next room, feeling the absence of a father. He would never know. Then training took over, the thousands of hours of conditioning that had programmed his body to respond to crisis with action rather than paralysis. He was moving before he was fully conscious, pulling himself from the wreckage, checking his weapon, assessing the situation with the cool detachment of a professional warrior. The helicopter was destroyed, but miraculously, none of the operators had been seriously injured. Commander Morrison was already organizing the team, redirecting them toward the main building where bin Laden was believed to be hiding. The mission was compromised, the element of surprise lost, the carefully rehearsed plan crumbling into chaos. But SEALs did not fail. SEALs adapted. SEALs overcame. As Jocko Willink would later write, discipline equals freedom. And in this moment of maximum disorder, the discipline that had been beaten into these warriors through years of brutal training set them free to improvise, to adapt, to continue the mission regardless of circumstances. The breach of the main building happened with explosive efficiency, the door disintegrating under the shaped charge as Daniel flowed through with his team, his rifle up, his eyes scanning through night vision for threats. A figure appeared in the hallway, one of bin Laden's couriers, armed with an AK-47, his face contorted with shock at the apparitions materializing from the darkness. Marcus Cole's rifle spoke twice, and the courier crumpled, his weapon clattering uselessly to the floor. They moved up the stairs in tactical formation, each operator covering their assigned sector, their movements synchronized by training so intense they had become instinct. Gunfire erupted from a room on the second floor, rounds snapping past Daniel's head close enough that he could feel the displaced air. He returned, fire without conscious thought, his rounds finding flesh, another enemy falling. The smell of curdite filled the air, mixing with the copper scent of blood and the acrid smoke of the breached charges. This was combat at its most pure and terrible close quarters, life and death separated by fractions of seconds, skill and training the only barriers between existence and oblivion. And through it all, Daniel moved with a calm that seemed almost supernatural, as if some guiding hand was directing his movements, protecting him from the chaos that swirled around him. The third floor loomed above them, the final destination of a journey that had begun 23 years ago. In the mountains of Afghanistan, Commander Morrison positioned his team at the base of the stairs, his hand signals communicating. The assault plan with silent efficiency. Daniel would be first through the door, followed by Marcus and Priest, with Morrison covering their rear. The symbolism was not lost on any of them. The son of Thomas Reeves would be the first to confront the man who had murdered his father. It was fitting. It was fate. It was the culmination of a story that had been writing itself since before Daniel was old enough to understand loss. He began climbing the stairs, each step bringing him closer to the moment he had imagined countless times, had dreamed about, had trained for with obsessive dedication. His father's face appeared in his mind, not the photograph, but the dream father who had visited him throughout his childhood, offering encouragement and strength during the darkest moments of his life. "I'm here, Dad," Daniel thought, the words forming silently in his mind. "I'm here, and I'm finishing what you started." The door at the top of the stairs was closed. Behind it, the most wanted man in history waited, unaware that justice had finally found him, that the past had finally caught up with the present, that a son was about to honor his father in the most profound way imaginable. "I am not afraid of an army of lions led by a sheep. I am afraid of an army of sheep led by a lion." Alexander the Great. The door shattered inward under Daniel's boot, and time seemed to fracture into discrete frames. Each moment burned into his memory with photographic clarity. The room was dark, illuminated only by the glow of his night vision, the green-tinted world revealing shapes and shadows that resolved into furniture, curtains, a bed against the far wall. And standing beside that bed, his tall frame unmistakable even after years of hiding, his beard gray with age, his eyes wide with the shock of a man who had believed himself invincible. Osama bin Laden. For one eternal second, their eyes met across the darkness. The terrorist and the son of the man he had murdered, predator and avenger, evil and justice. Daniel saw recognition flash across bin Laden's face, not recognition of him specifically, but recognition of what he represented, the inevitable consequence of decades of violence. The bill finally coming due for all the blood he had spilled. A woman screamed somewhere in the darkness. Bin Laden's hand moved toward something beside the bed, and Daniel Reeves, son of Thomas Reeves, child of sacrifice, inheritor of a legacy written in courage and blood, did what he had been born to do. His rifle rose, his finger found the trigger, and he fired. The shots echoed through the compound like thunder, like the voice of God pronouncing judgment, like the final notes of a symphony that had been playing since September 11th, 2001. Bin Laden crumpled, the architect of terror falling with the same pathetic helplessness as his countless victims, the myth of his invincibility shattered forever by the bullets of a young man whose very existence he had never suspected. Daniel stood over the body, his chest heaving, his rifle still trained on the fallen figure, watching for any sign of movement that would require additional response. Behind him, he heard Morrison's voice reporting through the radio. "Geronimo, Geronimo." Ikiae, the code words that would send shockwaves around the world, that would bring closure to thousands of families who had waited a decade for this moment. But for Daniel, the moment was both larger and smaller than global significance. It was personal. It was familial. It was the fulfillment of a promise made to a ghost who had visited him in dreams, the completion of a journey that had begun in a 3-year-old's grief. He thought of his father lying in some unmarked grave in Afghanistan, his sacrifice unknown, his memory erased by the same government that had now used his son to achieve its greatest victory, and standing over the corpse of his father's killer. Daniel Reeves finally allowed himself to feel something he had suppressed for 20 years, peace. The extraction was chaos-controlled. By discipline, the remaining helicopter descending into the compound while Pakistani military sirens began wailing in the distance. They had minutes, perhaps less, before the situation escalated beyond their ability to manage. Commander Morrison directed the team with clipped efficiency, coordinating the collection of intelligence, the destruction of the crashed helicopter, the loading of bin Laden's body onto the aircraft. Daniel moved through these tasks mechanically, his body operating on autopilot while his mind processed what had just occurred. He had done it. After a lifetime of preparation, after years of training, after a journey that had taken him from an abandoned child to an elite warrior, he had looked into the eyes of his father's killer and delivered justice. The weight of that realization settled over him like a physical presence, not crushing but completing, filling a void that had existed at the center of his being for as long as he could remember. Marcus Cole grabbed his shoulder as they loaded onto the helicopter, his eyes communicating respect and understanding that needed no words. Priest Vargas made the sign of the cross and whispered something in Spanish, a prayer of thanksgiving for missions accomplished and vengeance fulfilled. And Commander Morrison, the man who had initially objected to a rookie on this mission, met Daniel's gaze with a nod that carried more meaning than any medal or commendation ever could. The helicopter lifted off just as the first Pakistani military vehicles appeared at the compound's gate, their spotlights sweeping across the destruction left behind, their occupants arriving too late to prevent or even witness the moment that had just changed history. Inside the aircraft, the SEALs sat in exhausted silence, the adrenaline of combat slowly draining from their systems, the reality of what they had accomplished beginning to penetrate the fog of operational focus. They had killed Osama bin Laden. They had conducted the most successful special operations mission in American history, and they had done it with a rookie who had turned out to be anything but a young man whose destiny had been written before he was born, whose entire existence had been a preparation for this single, defining moment. Daniel stared out the open cargo door at the Pakistani landscape rushing past below, the darkness broken only by scattered lights from villages where people slept, unaware that the world had just fundamentally changed. He thought about his mother waking up tomorrow to news that would make no sense to her, that would seem like just another chapter in an endless war she had never understood. He thought about the classified truth that she would never know, that her husband had not died in a training accident, that her son had just avenged his father in the most dramatic fashion imaginable. Some secrets, he realized, were meant to remain secret. Some closure could only exist in the heart of those who had earned it. The soldier above all others prays for peace, for it is the soldier who must suffer and bear the deepest wounds and scars of war. General Douglas MacArthur, the sun rose over Afghanistan as the helicopter touched down at Jalalabad airfield, painting the sky with colors that seemed impossibly beautiful. After the darkness of the night, Daniel was the last to exit the aircraft, his boots touching the tarmac with a finality that marked the end of one journey and the beginning of another. The mission was complete, but life continued, and he knew that the days and weeks ahead would bring debriefs, medical evaluations, psychological assessments, the endless bureaucratic aftermath that followed every operation. But those concerns seemed distant, almost irrelevant, compared to the quiet resolution that had settled into his soul. He had honored his father. He had fulfilled a destiny that had been waiting for him since childhood. He had proven that some bonds, the bonds of family, of blood, of love that transcends death, are stronger than any enemy, any distance, any span of time. Walking toward the compound where the rest of the team was already gathering, Daniel paused and looked up at the lightning sky. In his mind, he composed a letter to the father he had never known, a message that would never be written down but would live forever in his heart. I found him, Dad. I found the man who took you from us, and I made him pay. You can rest now. We both can. Commander Morrison found him there, standing alone at the edge of the airfield, watching the sun complete its ascent over the mountains. The older man stood beside his young operator, without speaking, understanding that some moments required nothing more than silent companionship. Finally, after several minutes had passed, Morrison spoke. Your father, he said quietly, would be prouder than words can express. Daniel turned to face his commanding officer, and for the first time since the mission began, allowed a small smile to cross his face. "I know," he replied. "I felt him with me in that room. When I raised my rifle, when I took the shot, I wasn't alone. Wherever he is, he was there." Morrison nodded, his weathered face softening with an expression that few people ever witnessed from the legendary commander. "That's what it means to be part of something larger than yourself," he said. "That's what separates warriors from soldiers, heroes from men who simply wear uniforms. Your father understood that. And now, so do you." They stood together as the base came alive around them, watching the beginning of a new day that would bring news of bin Laden's death to a world that had waited a decade for this moment. The war on terror would continue. Other missions would follow. Other enemies would rise to challenge the nation they served. But for Daniel Reeves' rookie no longer, warrior proven, sun finally a peace this sunrise marked something more than just another day. In the years that followed, Daniel would continue to serve with SEAL Team 6, would conduct dozens of additional operations, would earn commendations and promotions that recognized his exceptional abilities. But he would never speak of Operation Neptune Spear, never claim credit for the shot that killed bin Laden, never reveal the extraordinary circumstances that had placed him in that room on that night. The official record would list only identification numbers and redacted names, the truth buried under layers of classification that would remain intact for decades. And that was exactly how Daniel wanted it. His father had served in silence, had sacrificed without recognition, had died in anonymity so that others might live in freedom. Daniel would honor that legacy by following the same path a warrior in the shadows, a ghost who moved through the world without leaving traces, a son carrying forward a tradition of service that stretched back through generations of his family and forward into a future he could not yet imagine. As David Goggins wrote, "We all have the ability to be uncommon amongst uncommon people, to be that person who can dig deeper when everyone else has quit." Thomas Reeves had been that person, and now, so was his son. The world celebrated the death of Osama bin Laden, crowds gathering spontaneously outside the White House, flags waving. Justice finally served after years of patience and persistence. Politicians gave speeches, analysts offered commentary. Historians began writing the first drafts of a story that would be told for centuries. But in a quiet corner of Virginia Beach, in a room that contained only a bed, a desk, and a single photograph of a young man standing before a mud brick building in Afghanistan, Daniel Reeves sat in silence and let himself finally, completely, grieve for the father he had avenged but could never bring back. The tears came slowly at first, then in waves that shook his entire body. Years of suppressed emotion finally released by the completion of a journey that had defined his entire existence. When the tears subsided, he picked up the photograph and held it against his chest, feeling the connection to a man who had shaped his life without ever being present in it. "Thank you, Dad," he whispered into the empty room, "for everything you sacrificed, for everything you taught me without ever saying a word. I hope I made you proud." And somewhere, in whatever realm exists beyond the boundaries of mortal understanding, Thomas Reeves smiled down at his son and knew that his legacy was secure. Heroes may not be braver than anyone else. They're just braver 5 minutes longer. Ronald Reagan, and so the rookie who no one took seriously became the warrior who changed history. Operation Neptune Spear will be remembered for many things: the courage of the SEALs, who risked everything, the intelligence work that made it possible, the justice finally delivered to the victims of September 11th. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of that night was a story that will never appear in any official account, the story of a son who spent his entire life preparing for a moment of reckoning with his father's killer, a young man whose identification number 878 concealed a legacy of sacrifice and service that stretched back decades. Daniel Reeves proved that night that some bonds cannot be broken by death, that some debts must be paid regardless of time or distance, that the love between a father and son can transcend the boundaries of mortality itself. If this story has moved you, if you feel the echo of that ancient connection resonating in your own heart, then subscribe to our channel, share this with someone who needs to hear it, and remember, we are all the products of those who came before us, carrying their dreams and their sacrifices into futures they could only imagine. The warrior's path does not end with a single battle. It continues through generations, through bloodlines, through the unbroken chain of courage that connects those who serve to those who will serve after them. Daniel Reeves understood this truth, and now, so do you.